So we are in our fourth shiur together in the Laws of Kashrut. As you may have already noticed, that most of the topics that we have chosen for this series are rabbinic in nature. Rabbinic in nature means inevitably that they're not as, I don't want to use the word crucial, but they're not as severe as other prohibitions. The reason why I focused on these is because some of the other things which we would focus on that are biblical by nature likely would be a little too earth-shattering to cover in an introductory session on the Laws of Kashrut. There are things that really need to be spoken about. But second, I think that the issues that people make in the world of Kashrut, the anthills that turn into mountains, are usually the rabbinic prohibitions that are so blown out of proportion that we need to kind of reel them back in and understand exactly what it is that we're doing or not doing. And so that brings me to today's shiur, which is about what we may know in modern Jewish lingo as Pat Yisrael or Pas Yisrael, or however you may call this. Pat Yisrael is the need, seemingly, to have bread that we eat, or baked goods that we eat, be baked by Jewish people in order for them to be fitting for our table. Now, usually the way that I teach is we start in sources and we build up an idea. I've noticed in the past that has been confusing for a few individuals, and so I want to just say a few things now so we don't need to repeat them later. Though this is about kashrut, it has actually nothing to do with kashrut. What I mean to tell you is, when we discuss whether or not we can buy bread or baked goods from a non-Jewish bakery, we are not talking about, are the ingredients kasher, how do we figure out the flour is yashan, all of those things are issues that need to be dealt with. Now, when we talk about Pat Yisrael, if it's permissible or it's not permissible, it's assuming that all the ingredients are kasher. It's assuming that all of the ovens and machinery and utensils that are used are kasherim. It's assuming that the flour is yashan and permissible. It's assuming there's no lard in the bread and there's no whatever else you might be concerned about. All of those things are important, but they're not important to this seif in Shulchan Aruch. So we are talking now about ingredients-wise and utensil-wise, completely kasher bread. The only problem with it, seemingly, is that it has been baked by someone who's not Jewish. That's the focus of today's shiur, and that's exactly what we're going to be delving into today in source number 1. Mishnah Avodah Zarah. This Mishnah tells us, Elu devarim shel goyim asurim. These are things of the non-Jews that are prohibited. Ve'en isuran isur hana'ah. But they're not prohibited in such a way that we're unable to actually get any type of benefit from them. So, for example, a meat and milk mixture that is forbidden. Let's think of an example. A cheeseburger that the cheese is actually grilled onto it. That's a biblical prohibition. Not only can I not eat it, I also can't sell it. I can't derive benefit from it. These things are things that are prohibited in this Mishnah, but they're not prohibited to derive benefit from. Chalav shechalavo goy, milk that was milked by a non-Jew. Ve'en Yisrael ro'ehu, and a Jewish person is not able to see him milking the cow. This is known in modern lingo as Chalav Yisrael, which is a misnomer in terms of words entirely. But we're going to have a dedicated class to this part of the Mishnah. Vehapat, bread. Ve'hashemen shenahen, and their oil. So these are things that we're not allowed to purchase from non-Jews, even though they are completely kasher. It's the milk, it's the bread, and it's the oil. Rabbi uvedino, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his Bet Hadin, hitiru b'shemen. They took back, they retracted this rule concerning oil, and oil of non-Jews is permissible to purchase. Ushlakot, and their cooked foods, ukvashin shedarkan atet dochan yain v'chometz, and all kinds of pickle things they put vinegar and wines into. The rest of the Mishnah is really not relevant for us right now. But these concepts that we're going to talk about in the coming weeks, milk that was milked by a non-Jew, bread that was baked by a non-Jew, oil that is sold by a non-Jew, cooked foods that were cooked by non-Jews. All of these are prohibited on a rabbinic level from the Mishnah. Now, one more clarification that I can make before we go forward. Just like last time I asked you to keep in mind that there's a complete difference between tivilat kelim, immersing utensils in a mikveh, and hechsher kelim, and kashering utensils from non-kasher use. you must keep the two halachot of baked goods of non-Jews and cooked foods of non-Jews completely separate from each other. Though they are mentioned in the same place, they have completely different understandings in halakha. And I'll refer to them as pat shel goyim, the bread baked by non-Jews, and bishule goyim, the food that is cooked by non-Jews. God willing, next week's class is going to be all about food that was cooked by non-Jews. Today, I'm not talking about food. I'm only talking about bread and baked goods. What determines something, what makes something a baked good versus a cooked food? That'll be next week's class, to differentiate between those two things. But you can imagine for right now, breads, baguettes, bagels, possibly. Pizza, that's not the cheese, ignore it. So doughs, pitas, lafas, lavash, all of those things are breads that we're talking about here in this Mishnah. Why are these things prohibited? Is a fantastic question. The Talmud Bavli, Masechet Avodah Zarah, page 35b, writes, the Mishnah discusses this topic here of pat shel goyim. And it says, Amar Rabbi Kana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, pat lo hutra bebedin. Bread was not permitted in the bedin. Which bedin permitted something? The bedin of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi permitted oil. So here he's telling us the bedin did not permit the eating of non-Jewish bread. Michlal di kaman de share. It seems from this you're telling me the bedin did not prohibit bread. It means that somebody permitted the bread. It just wasn't the bedin. Yes. The Gemara says that when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he told the following story. Once Rabbi Yehuda Nasi went out into the field, and a non-Jew brought before him bread that was baked in a large baker's oven. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said, how beautiful is this bread? Why did the Chachamim say we shouldn't eat it? The Gemara says, what do you mean, why did the Chachamim say we shouldn't eat it? The reason we shouldn't eat it, mishum chatanut, because it can lead to marriage with non-Jews. So you're going to have to ignore all kinds of jokes you might know about mixed dancing and everything else. Right now there's a prohibition here. The prohibition is, it is forbidden to eat bread that is baked by non-Jews, mishum chatnut. Nothing to do with kashrut. Everything to do with the fact that breaking bread with somebody else brings us close to them. When we are close with people, we end up becoming friends. We end up becoming friends, we'll end up marrying each other. The prohibition of intermarriage is so severe, and clearly there was a problem of it, that our Chachamim prohibited certain things because they bring us to closer relations that are more than just intellectual relations, emotional relationships with non-Jews. And in order to preserve our people marrying only themselves, our Chachamim prohibited us from eating bread. The Gemara explains that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was not asking in general the question, why is bread not allowed? Rather, he was asking, why here in the field? Here in the field, I'm not eating with this non-Jew. I've got nothing to do with him. I'm working, I'm traveling, whatever it might be. Why here is it prohibited to eat the bread of a non-Jew? The Gemara notes something interesting. Kisvurin ha'am hitir Rabbi hapat, velohi, Rabbi lo hitir et hapat. People, the nation, began thinking that when Rabbi Yehuda said, hey, why did the Chachamim not let us eat this bread? They immediately assumed that must mean that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says we're allowed to eat the bread. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did not permit eating the bread. And that's why our rabbis tell us the Bedin did not permit eating bread. But the people understood Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's question as if saying, hey, bread should be allowed to be consumed in the field. Rav Yosef Vitem Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, there's another version of this story. Lo kach haya maseh. This wasn't the story. One time Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was traveling, and he found that the students in the Beit Midrash didn't have enough bread. Amar Rabbi says, En kan palter? Is there no one here who can bake bread? Kisvurin ha'am lomar palter goy, v'hu lo amar ela palter Yisrael. They thought that he was asking, are there no non-Jewish bakers here? But he was really saying, aren't there any Jewish bakers here? The Gemara continues that because of this, the people understood. If you look on the top of page 2 on the top right, the people understood that, hey, maybe Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is saying that bread baked by a non-Jewish baker must be kasher, and that's not the case. And the Gemara then brings a third and final story. I don't know exactly how to pronounce his name. Evo. Hava mankit v'achal pat. He would bite and eat bread. He would go to the corners of the fields and he would eat bread over there. Rava says, V'tem Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, some say it's Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak, lo tishteu behadeh de'evo dekachi lach madar mai. Don't speak with Evu as he eats the bread of non-Jews, and you shouldn't speak with a person who violates rabbinic prohibitions like that. And so here the Gemara concludes that in all of these scenarios, there were people who acted permissively regarding non-Jewish bread, but that the Chachamim were not the ones who permitted this. Rather, they were either individuals like Evo or the nation themselves, the people, they understood the bread to be permitted. And that's why rabbis tell us that the Bedin, you should be very clear, even though people act permissively regarding bread baked by non-Jews, the Bedin is not the one who permitted this. In source number 3, the Gemara continues to discuss this matter. Let's read it in English. The Gemara says, Bale says that Avimi of Nota says in the name of Rav, the prohibitions with regards to non-Jewish bread and their oil, their wine, and their daughters are all from the 18 matters issued in a single day in the time of the students of Shammai and Hillel. If you look in source 4, the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat, chapter 1, Mishnah 4 says, Velu min halachot she'amru ba'aliyat Hananiah ben Chizkiah ben Gurion kshalu levako, nimnu v'rabu bet Shammai el bet Hillel, u'shmona asar devarim gazru bo bayom. There was a situation here in Masechet Shabbat. I recently spoke about this in one of my Agadata classes, my Rambam classes. Here, there were certain things that were prohibited, that were done in a certain type of forum, in the attic of Hananiah ben Chizkiah ben Gurion. And these things, like not eating non-Jewish bread or not eating their oil, are of those things. So the Gemara asks, with regard to their daughters, what is the decree? Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak says that there seems to be an issue with the non-Jewish woman being, I don't want to use the word impure, they were nidot. And even from a very young age, Chachamim were concerned about this. The Gemara quickly dismisses that opinion and presents another opinion. If you look on the top left of page 2, Geneva says in the name of Rav, Kulan mishum avodat kochavim gazru behen. All of these decrees were there because Jews might come to participate in idol worship if they're eating non-Jewish bread, for example. And so when Rav Acha bar Ada came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said, Rabbi Yitzchak says, they decreed a prohibition upon their bread due to their oil. The Gemara says, in what way is the prohibition with regard to oil stronger than the prohibition with regard to bread? That is, why does the primary concern relate to the oil of non-Jews rather than their bread? And the Gemara says, now a different interpretation in the last part of source 3. They decreed on the bread and the oil because of their wine. And they made a decree on their wine because of their daughters. And on their daughters they made a prohibition because of something else. And something else they made on something else. This is a long decree. You want to look into the Gemara here yourself to understand what are all these something else. You are welcome to. But again, we see that there's a reason why we are not allowed to eat non-Jewish bread, and it has nothing to do with kashrut. I'm going to skip source 5. It discusses those things that are very similar to what we just did right now, that are prohibited, that were prohibited in that attic of the Chachamim. And you find yourself in source 6. In source 6, we see Amar Ravina. Ravina says, Hilchada, the halacha is, Harifta de shagar goy v'afa Yisrael, bread, the shagar goy v'afa Yisrael, that a non-Jew needed and sent to a Jewish person, or shagar Yisrael v'afa goy, or bread that was sent by a Jew but was baked by a non-Jew, or shagar goy v'afa vet kochavim, or it was sent by a non-Jew, was baked by a non-Jew, v'ata Yisrael, and a Jew came v'chita b'chitueh, and he stoked the coals under the bread. Shapir dami. That is permissible because the Jewish person, though minimally involved in the baking process, has now done something to improve the baking of this bread, and therefore that bread is considered baked by a Jewish person. So you have here a number of different scenarios which bread might be kasher. It's either that the Jew baked the bread that a non-Jew made, it's that the non-Jew baked the bread the Jew made, and a Jewish person came to to stoke the coals under the fire. The Gemara now tells us a story in source 7. The Gemara relates a relevant incident. Rabbi Yehuda Nasiah. Rabbi Yehuda Nasiah is the grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So this is the author of the Mishnah. Now this is the grandson. He was traveling, leaning upon the shoulder of Rabbi Simlai. If he was leaning, could be he was literally traveling on his shoulders. But I didn't write the English translation. Who was Rabbi Simlai? He was his gabai, his shamash, his attendant. Rabbi Yonatan Halevy said to him, Simlai, you were not in the study hall last night when we permitted the oil of goyim. Rabbi Simlai said to him, Biyamenu tatir afet apat. In our days, you will ultimately allow us to eat bread that was baked by non-Jews. Amar lo, he tells him, Karulan bedina sharia. If I permit bread baked by non-Jews, I'm afraid to do that because all of my colleagues will call my bedin a very permissive bedin. So this persecution, by the way, of Chachamim for ruling leniently in halachic matters, and then calling them, oh, that rabbi is too permissive, it's not a new problem. It's a very old problem in Israel. Rabbi Yonatan Halevy was worried about it. The Tanan, we learned, He'id Rabbi Yosef ben Yoezer, Ish Tzereda. Rabbi Yosef ben Yoezer, Ish Tzereda, said a number of things that were permissible. V'kar wale Yosef Sharia. And the rabbis nicknamed him Yosef, the permissive one. He's always allowing everybody to do things okay. Somebody once said, this rabbi, he's called Rav Matir Asurim. He's the rabbi who permits everything that is prohibited. This mockery, though, was something that Rabbi Yosef ben Yoezer felt, and Rabbi Yonatan Halevy was afraid of experiencing. Amar le, on page 4, Amar le hatam shar atrat. He permitted 3 things. That's why they called him a permissive bedin. Umar shar echada, and you, rabbi, you only permit 1 thing, the oil. Vi shari mara achada achiti. He says, I have a problem because I have already given 2 prior permissive rulings, and this number 3 will cause me to be considered a permissive chacham. And because of that, it seems that he didn't actually permit the bread. But you find here that Rabbi Yonatan Halevy was seemingly of the opinion, he was leaning towards the fact that bread baked by goyim, there was room to permit it, and the only thing that held him back from permitting it was the fact that people would speak about him in a poor fashion. The Ran, in source 8, mentions something very interesting. There's a question here, who this personality is in the story. And the Ran suggests that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was the one who initially wanted to permit bread, just like he permitted oil. But he seemingly tried to teach it, and the people did not accept it from the author of the Mishnah. So the grandson came around, and he wanted to permit it himself, and the rabbis accepted it from him. Where do we find that Chachamim are permissive regarding non-Jewish bread? It seems to not be found in our Babylonian Talmud. We find a reference to permitting non-Jewish bread in the Jerusalem Talmud, in the Yerushalmi Talmud. If you look in source 9, Pitan, the Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah, Talmud Yerushalmi, the 2nd chapter, the 8th halacha, the Gemara here discusses whether non-Jewish bread is permitted or not. Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha b'shem Rabbi Yochanan, in source 9, Rabbi Yaakov, the son of Acha, in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, says, Pat, bread, mehalachot shel imum hi. They're of the laws of imum. What is imum? So there are commentaries on the page, but there's an English version of this word, and if you look in source 10 for just a moment, there was a Rabbi Marcus Jastrow. Have you heard of Rabbi Marcus Jastrow before? I found a biography of him not so long ago. A very interesting personality to read about. What I will tell you is we're talking about permissive rabbis. It's amazing to me how his book and his name has become a household name in almost every yeshiva, at least in the English-speaking world. I can tell you his books are found everywhere. There's not a Beit Midrash that I studied in that was an English-speaking Beit Midrash that didn't have his books. Yet if you were to research a little bit about him and his life and his rabbinic career, you might wonder, just like I, how he made it into the rabbinic world. He was one of the early rabbis of the Reform movement here in the United States. You could go research him on your own. He writes here, imum, or imam in a verb fashion. What is it? Obscuring or suppressing the law. A regular measure passed in an emergency. It's a regulation that's passed in an emergency contrary to the real law. As there's a question in the Gemara, how dare you pass a prohibitory measure contrary to halakha? This law is a law of imum. There's a lot of, what do they translate here in English? They have a great word here. They translate it as obfuscation. I've never used that word in my entire life, but it's there on the page. This is an unclear word, area of halakha. If you skip towards the end, I bolded the top of page 4 on the left. Mekom she'en pat Yisrael metzuya, bedin hu sheteh pat goyim asura. In a place where you can buy Jewish bread, the law is that you cannot buy non-Jewish bread. V'imemu aleha, v'hitiruha, mipenei chayei nefesh. And imemu aleha, they obfuscated about this law, and now they've allowed the bread of non-Jews. For which reason? Mishum chaye nefesh. Unlike other things, cheese, foods, bread is a staple of life. Chaye nefesh. A person needs bread to survive. You travel, you go somewhere, the very bare necessities you need, water and bread. Lechem nechol ubegel lilbosh. That's what our forefather asked for. And because bread is such a crucial part of, it's a staple of human life, Chachamim permitted the consumption of non-Jewish bread. Rabbanin de Kesarin b'shem Rabbi Yaakov Baracha k'divrei mishehu matir u'bilvad min ha'palter. It can be, here it says the pilater, which is interesting. It can be that you're allowed to buy non-Jewish bread, but the only place you can buy non-Jewish bread from is a non-Jewish bakery, but not from a regular non-Jewish person at their home. V'lo avdin ken, but this is not the way that we act. So already in Talmud Yerushalmi, you find that Chachamim, or this is a certain group of Chachamim, permitted the consumption of non-Jewish bread that was baked in a commercial setting. Let's call that from now on pat palter or pat nachtom, the bread that was baked in a commercial setting, even though that's against the halakha, but because people's lives are dependent on bread, this is something that was permitted. There's some fascinating commentaries here on page 5, 11, 12. I'm going to skip them for now. Let's look at the Rambam on the bottom of page 5, source 13. Unfortunately, I don't have an edition of Rav Kapach's translation of the commentary in the Mishnah available to share, and I didn't bring my edition here. So I have it, but I don't have it to share. So I'm going to use whatever translation was available to me in Sefaria, and I'm aware of the flaws that are inherent in that translation. Elu devarim shel goyim. These are the things of the non-Jews that we're not allowed to eat. This is the first Mishnah that we quoted, source 1. Says the Rambam, Rov devarim elu. Most of these things, kagon hapat, like bread, v'shelakot, and the cooked foods, v'chayotze behen, and everything included in that category, kulam ne'esru kedei shnitrachek mihem. All of them were prohibited, so we stay away from them. V'lo nit'arev imahem, we should not get mixed in with them. Get mixed in with what? With bread. Not to get mixed in with the non-Jews. So we don't end up sending our hand and taking that which we're not allowed. And that's what our rabbis mean when they say that these things are prohibited because it will lead to intermarriage. And these are in those 18 things that were decided in the Mishnah and Shabbat. Now what you see, that we forbid their cooked foods, meaning kosher food. It's a kosher pot. The only flaw here is that a non-Jewish person cooked it. It's not because they cooked it in their pots and pans or some kind of kashrut issue here. These are the things that have nothing to do with kashrut status. And nothing else that might be problematic in that regard. The Rambam reiterates here, the prohibition of eating non-Jewish cooked foods has nothing to do with the kashrut status of the food. It's obvious if food is not kasher, you can't eat it. Meaning, if a non-Jew roasts a pork chop for you, you can't eat it because it's a pork chop. There's no reason for a rabbinic prohibition telling you not to eat it. Rather, there's something else, and that something else is our Chachamim instituted a law that says, stay away from non-Jewish bread, non-Jewish foods, whatever it might be, so that we don't come to marry them. And let's skip to the middle of the paragraph. I put another bold section. Upitam, their bread. It seems from our Babylonian Talmud, meaning not the Jerusalem Talmud, from the Babylonian Talmud. Shu asur, that it's prohibited. Aval pat hashuk shemochrin hanachtomin isuro me'at vekarov leheter mipad bale batim. Says the Rambam, but the bread that is baked by non-Jewish bakers in a commercial setting, not in a residential setting, it almost seems that it's mutar, meaning it's isuro me'at. It's a very weak prohibition, and it's very close to being permissible. Why? Tell me the logic. What's the difference between residential bread and commercial bread? Pat balabait and pat nachtom or pat palter.
You don't make a relationship with the person in a commercial setting. Whereas in a residential,
Very good. It's the difference between I move into a house and my next door neighbor bakes me brownies and brings them over. But in California, you have to be careful from the brownies your next door neighbor brings you. But here, they bring you brownies. You're not allowed to eat those things. Why? Because my neighbor is trying to make a friendship with me. That's exactly what Chachamim are prohibiting. When I go to a bakery and there's hundreds of people in line over there and there's a whole factory back there pumping out bread, that bread that I buy doesn't bring me any closer to the baker, to the person who's selling it. It's just a commercial setting. It's a financial transaction. As such, it's almost permissible to eat this bread. And those who are traveling, says the Rambam, and in any need situation, any situation where there rises a need, it is permissible, in my opinion. And you have to fall back on what is the custom of the country in which you live. Do the Chachamim permit the eating of non-Jewish bread, or do they not? Remember this concept here of minhag, because really, I want to hold it away from you all the way until the end of the class. I don't want to talk about minhagim until the end. The minhagim are fascinating, but if we study the minhagim first, there'll be no reason for this class. So let's not deal with the minhagim, and let's first look at the halachot as they are presented to us. There's a few tangents that we might take right here for just a moment. The Ramban mentions that if there's a decree that it didn't spread like wildfire throughout the Jewish community, not the whole Jewish community accepted it, then even a small bet adin is able to, meaning not the original bet adin, we have a famous rule. The rule is that if a bet adin rules on something, the only way you can overrule that bet adin is if the bet adin is equal or greater in number and stature. A smaller bet adin, though, can overrule a decree made by a previous rabbinic court as long as that decree wasn't taken on by the whole Jewish community. And even in a situation, says the Ramban, where this decree was not actually explicitly permitted by a bedin, we have no way to compel the nation to keep a gezerah that not the whole Jewish community accepted. These words are similar, though not identical, to the words of the Rambam in the introduction to the Mishneh Torah regarding the authority of rabbis to make decrees after the final supreme court of the Jewish people. They maybe have authority over their own people, but not over the entire Jewish community, and you're not able to compel people. Here the Ramban says something interesting. A smaller bet adin in stature or number can overrule a previous bet adin's gezerah, assuming that it wasn't accepted by the people. And even if a bet adin wasn't the one who did that, even if it wasn't the bet adin who overruled this, it just happened. People started being permissive in this matter. Like we see in the Gemara, the people misheard Rabbi Yonatan Halevy, they misunderstood him, and they were permissible. We don't force them to follow in these ways. It said, I saw furthermore that someone wrote, that because the only prohibition of eating non-Jewish bread is because we might come to marry their daughters. Nowadays, it's permissible. What's the logic? I don't want to translate that sentence. But let's just say that non-Jewish people really wanted to marry Jewish people. But nowadays, where the nations around us, and it doesn't apply anymore nowadays, but in the Ramban's days, that the nations around us have religious reasons why they're not allowed to marry us, that there's no reason to say we'll come to marry them because the Muslims don't marry us, the Christians won't marry us, and because of that, we don't have to have an extra safeguard to keep us away from marrying them. Says the Rambam, V'zeh ta'ud gedola. It should probably say v'zo ta'ud gedola. And this is a very grave error. And whoever uttered this ruling, it's not a good thing to rely on their halachic rulings. It's incorrect understanding. Rather, שאפילו כדבריו, כל דבר שגזרו בו ולא עמד בדין וביטל, אין אותה גזירה בטלה, אף על פי שבטל הטעם של מניין הראשון. Says the Ramban that you cannot just get rid of things that previous Batei Din they ruled, as long as, even if the reason is no longer relevant, the previous ruling of the Bedin stands. Tosafot, in source 15, and this is Tosafot on the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, page 35b. He writes, from that which the Gemara says, Pat lohutra bebedin, miklal di bai hava sharele, that you see that even though pat was not permitted in the Bet Hadin, there were those who treated this permissively. Alma, you see, lo pashat isuro, that the prohibition of bread, though it may have been decreed by our rabbis, never took on in the Jewish people. Umikana, from that fact, samchuata, we rely on now lechol pachel goyim, to eat bread baked by non-Jews. Kevan shelo pashat isuro b'chol Yisrael, because the prohibition on bread did not cross the entire Jewish people, was not accepted by the entire Jewish people. Tosafot here, does he seem to be making a difference between bread baked commercially and bread baked residentially? No, he's not. You have to remember that fact because it's going to play a role in deciding what the Ashkenazi custom is, as opposed to the Sephardic custom is regarding bread baked by non-Jews. Tosafot brings a number of other places where he says, for other places in the Gemara, for example, there's a rabbinic prohibition of decreeing a decree on the Jewish people, which they're not able to stand up to. So yeah, some people can keep it, but most people can't give up non-Jewish bread, and non-Jewish bread therefore would fall into the category of decrees that were already void when they were instituted. Or where else, he quotes the Gemara in Yerushalmi, Pat amdu alavi tiruhu, that the bread, the Chachamim got up and they ultimately permitted this bread. It's from this understanding of the Tosafot that bread of Goyim is completely permissible, and that is the custom that he observed in Ashkenaz. Tosafot writes something similar. Haraperetz in source 17 brings you a number of different sources that of the Rishonim, the Rif, the Ran. The Ran writes, let's look at the second paragraph in source 17. V'katav Haran, the Ran says, Shegzerat pat lo pashta berov Yisrael, that this decree against non-Jewish bread did not take on, the Jewish people did not take on this practice. Shegzera hi she'en rov hatzibur chuyim la'amod ba. This is a decree that most of the community was not able to uphold. Umishum hachin, because of this, yichol kol bedin la'atira. Any bedin who decides is able to permit this. So the fichach, and therefore katav Ramban, the Ramban writes, Shafilu bezman hazeh, even nowadays, im yaskimu chachamei Yisrael u'gdolehem u'matirim et hapat, that if the rabbis of the Jewish people were to permit non-Jewish bread, mutar, it's permissible. Ve'af al pi shehen ketanim b'talmidei Shammai v'Hillel b'chuma v'minyan, even though they are smaller in stature and number than the chachamim of Shammai and Hillel. Shari Yehuda Nasi katan mehem haya. The Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was smaller than them, and he didn't care to permit it, and therefore non-Jewish bread is permitted. The Rambam, which we're going to see soon, we'll talk about him in just a few moments. The Rambam, let's get to the Rambam in a few minutes. You know what? Let's get to the Rambam right now. I like the Rambam. Let's go to source, page 8. Page 8, I've quoted to you all of the halachot the Rambam talks about non-Jewish bread, and really I overdid it because only 2 of these halachot have to do with bread. But it's in the context of understanding what exactly the Rambam wants from us. So until now, let me summarize. There is a prohibition from the times of the Mishnah. You should know there are those who even argue that this prohibition is found earlier. In the book of Daniel, Daniel is careful when he's by the king to eat even the patbag. Some understand this to mean that he was careful even with the bread that was baked by non-Jews, and it was a separate thing from kashrut. He was concerned about bread baked by non-Jews. But I would be very wary to consider this one a biblical prohibition because it's from Daniel. So I'm not going there. I didn't bring it in my source sheet. But for right now, let's look on page 8. The Rambam writes the following in the 17th chapter of the Laws of Forbidden Foods. V'yesh sham devarim acherim. There are other things. The word sham, from my understanding, and I don't speak Arabic, it's a use of terms borrowed from Arabic. It's not actually referring to there's a place somewhere. Rather, it's an expression that when translated, if I can give you an example, I once read from an Ashkenazi rabbi in America. He wrote a book on halakha in Hebrew. And he was writing that when you go to someone's house on Shabbat, and he wrote there, when you go to someone's house, al Shabbat, literally on top of Shabbat, which is a grammatical error. I'm not accusing the Rambam of a grammatical error, but sometimes you find that a person's language that they speak day to day also affects the way that they speak in Hebrew and write in Hebrew, and that's normal. So this is possibly the Rambam's Arabic influence in his Hebrew. V'yesham devarim acherim. There are other things. Asru otan chachamim, that our rabbis prohibited. V'af al pi she'en lisuran ikar min haTorah, even if there is no biblical source for these prohibitions, gazru aleim, our rabbis decreed, kedei litrachek min hagoyim, in order to distance us from the non-Jews. The Rambam is saying exactly what he said in his commentary on the Mishnah. Ad shelo yitarvu behen Yisrael, so the Jewish people will not come to intermingle with them, v'yavo lidei chatnut, and ultimately it will protect the Jews from marrying out of the Jewish faith. Ve'eluhen, and these are the things that our rabbis prohibited. Asur lishtot imahem, it is forbidden to drink with non-Jews. What does it mean, it is forbidden to drink from non-Jews? Drink what? Water? Alcohol. Acham said drink. It is forbidden to drink alcohol with non-Jews. Now I know that I may now have ruined many people's plans for tonight, and I don't intend to do that for you, but I'm just reading to you exactly what the Rambam writes here. It is forbidden to drink with them. Even in a place where we don't have to be afraid of yain nesech, of wine that is forbidden to us. And it's forbidden to eat their bread that they bake, or the foods they cooked. And even in places where we're not worried about kashrut, everything is kasher. The pots are kasher, the ingredients are kasher. There are things that are prohibited to do. Drinking alcohol, eating their bread, and eating their cooked foods. Ketzad. So for example, you could read Halakha Yud on your own. The Rambam talks about situations where it is prohibited or permitted to drink alcoholic beverages that were made by non-Jews, as well as in source Yud Aleph. Right now let's get to bread. Yud Bet. Afal pi she'asru pat goyim. Even though the bread of non-Jews is prohibited, yesh mekomot shemekilin badavar. There are places which are lenient in this matter. V'lokchim pat, meaning they're permissive in this matter. V'lokchim pat min anachtom hagoy. And they buy bread that was baked commercially by non-Jews. B'makom she'en sham nachtom Yisrael. In places where there are no Jewish bakers. Uvasadeh, and in the field, meaning out of the city, out of their homes. Mipnei shishat adochat. Because those are pressing times. Aval pat bale batim. But the bread that is baked in someone else's house, residential bread, en sham misha more bal hakel. There is no one who permits this bread. So let's put Tosafot on the side right now. There is no one, meaning no one in our Sephardic solar system, who permits bread to be baked by a non-Jewish person in their home. Shikar gezerah, because the main reason behind this prohibition, mishum chatnut, is because of marriage. Vim yuchal pat bale batim yavo lisodatan. And it's inevitable that if you come to eat bread baked by your non-Jewish friends, that you will come to eat in their home, and that would then lead to the whole problem. In Halakha Yud Gimel, Hidlik hagoy tatanur v'afa bo Yisrael. If a non-Jew turned on the oven and a Jew baked in the oven, remember that you must separate all of these halachot from cooking. We're now only talking about baking, not cooking. Hidlik hagoy tatanur. A non-Jew turned on the oven. V'afa bo Yisrael, and a Jewish person baked bread in that oven. O shehidlik Yisrael v'afa goy, or a Jew turned on the oven and a non-Jew baked it. By the way, this is the teaching of Ravina. Before I said sent, the fire. O shehidlik goy v'afa goy, or the non-Jew lit the fire and baked. Uva Yisrael v'ni'ar ha'esh me'at, and the Jew came and stoked the coals a little bit. However, what I was just telling you is a correction from what I said earlier. On source 6, I said the word sent instead of lit. Mechila was a mistake on my end. The Rambam is now saying again in Hebrew. Now that he has been involved in the baking of the bread, the non-Jewish bread is now permitted. And even if the Jew only threw a little piece of wood, a twig, into the fire, and then all of the bread inside of it is permitted. The only reason a Jewish person has to be involved in the baking process in the first place is just that we have a heker, that we recognize that their bread is technically prohibited for us. So let me summarize now what the Rambam says. The Rambam says bread baked by non-Jews is prohibited, whether residential bread or commercial bread. But there are places where this did not seem to, the rabbis were permissive in this matter, and because of that, in those places, Jews buy commercial bread but not residential bread. There is nowhere that permits residential bread. Finally, the 13th section here is that according to the one that says that it's prohibited, according to halakha, where bread of non-Jews is prohibited, it is permitted in one of the following three ways. Either the Jew turns on the fire and the non-Jew bakes it, or the non-Jew turns on the fire and the Jew bakes it. I mean, one of those scenarios, or a non-Jew turned on the fire, a non-Jew bakes it, but a Jewish person is involved even minimally, throwing that's not just stoking the coals, but even throwing a wood pick into the oven is enough to make all of that bread kasher according to everybody. And here ends the Rambam's laws of Pachad Goyim. So exactly 2.5 halachot. If you turn with me to page 9, you will find that as generations move forward, things seem to get more complicated. And Maran, Shulchan Aruch, Siman Kuf Yud Bet, Maran already has 16 chapters, meaning simanim, one siman, but 16 seifim, 16 sub-chapters, all on the topic of whether bread of Jews or non-Jews, how it's prohibited, is it prohibited, when is it prohibited, and that, B'ezrat Hashem, is going to be the focus of the next part of the shiur. So, any questions until now about anything we learned until now? If I didn't answer it yet, I will let you know that I'm going to answer it. Okay, moving forward. On page 9, Halakha Aleph, and I added here the notes. Peretz did not write notes on this siman, but I have his notes that he wrote in general on Bishulei Goyim, and I embellished them onto the Shulchan Aruch here, so that we can have some point of reference while we're learning. That's why they're more sparse than some of the other commentaries that we've studied of his. Maran writes Shulchan Aruch, Asru chachamim lechol pat shel amamei ovdei kochavim. Our rabbis prohibit us from eating bread of non-Jews. Mishum chatnut, because we might come to marry them. Va'afilu b'makom deleka mishum chatnut asur. The Rama quotes the Rashba, and he says that even in a place where there is no fear that we might come to marry them, even then it's prohibited. What is the Rama coming to include in this case? It's not about commercial bakeries or non-commercial bakeries. Tell me a person who there's no way in the world we can marry their daughters. Please, b'chavod.
Is it referring to the situation that they mentioned earlier about that non-Jews is against their religion to marry Jews?
Okay, very good. So I think the Taz or the Shach, one of them brings a source. Imagine there's a royal family. The royal family is not allowed to marry a peasant like you, especially you're Jewish. It's even worse than a regular peasant. So even then, where they're not allowed to marry us, it still wouldn't help. We wouldn't be allowed to eat their bread. There's another scenario. Who else do we not have to be concerned that we might come to marry their daughters?
Anybody in the church that doesn't get married necessarily?
Very good. The Taz and the Shach both bring this. A priest who's not allowed to get married, inevitably has no children. By the way, that assumption, you can make it. I didn't make it. So inevitably, assuming the priest doesn't have children, so maybe you could be able to eat the bread of a Catholic priest. No, also then, rabbis did not differentiate between whether somebody can have children, doesn't have children, will marry you. Rather, this prohibition is a blanket prohibition against non-Jewish bread. That's what the Rama is coming to add. I don't think that Maran is arguing with that. It's simply the Rama is adding in a detail here. And the only breads that are prohibited are breads that are baked out of the 5 grains. But bread that's made from rice or other kitniot, like beans, whatever else it might be, and no bichlal pat stam shasru, is not those things are not included in the prohibition of bread, which we're not allowed to eat. Now, they could be prohibited under the prohibition of food that was cooked by non-Jews. But for right now, in dealing with the world of bread, we're only talking about bread that are made from the 5 grains. So breads whose blessings would be hamotzi, or baked goods whose blessings would be mizonot. Yes? The Rama writes, "V'gam eino asur mishum bishulei goyim." Those types of foods are not prohibited because of bishulei goyim, because assuming they don't enter a king's table, like I said, we're going to discuss this already next week. Harav Peretz writes in source 1 here, "Kagon pata kumarim," the bread of the priest. Shen lehem banim, they don't have children. Asu, it's still prohibited. What about pat Yehudi mumar? What about a Jewish person who converts out of our faith? What if a Jewish person becomes a Catholic priest? Can we eat his bread? Mutar. She'en bo mishum chatnut. Because there is no prohibition of marrying his children. If his daughter is a kashera Jew, she's kashera, and I'm a kasher Jew, I can marry his daughter. The father-in-law doesn't make the daughter not Jewish. Because of that, in this situation, it doesn't apply. This is a pitret tshuva. You should know, unfortunately, this is not the prevalent practice. At least not among... I'm holding my tongue here. I will tell you that when I was growing up, I'll tell you a story and you figure it out yourself. I was growing up, I went to a Jewish day school, and in the Jewish day school we had these Israeli Hebrew teachers. And not all of them were respectful of Jewish tradition, of course, they're Israelis. And they were teaching in the Jewish school. But not all of them were observant of Shabbat the way perhaps the spiritual management of the school would like for them to observe Shabbat. And as such, when they would bake cookies, like for Purim, they made the Haman's ears, whatever they want to, the cookies they eat. Or on, what was it? It was Chanukah, they wanted to make donuts, whatever it might be. All of those things, every time they wanted to bake with us, they had to go find a person who was observant of halakha, and they had to turn on the oven for them, because God forbid a person who was not observant of halakha like them was not allowed to turn on the oven. Lama said this is not something that anybody has to be concerned about, because the logic is those people are kasher Jews. We can marry them. We can marry their children. The rabbinic prohibition, mishum chatnut, should not apply there. Bet yesh mekomot shemekilin b'davar. There are places which are lenient in this matter. Velokchim pat minachtom hagoy, and they take bread from a non-Jewish baker. B'makom she'en sham nachtom Yisrael, in a place where there is no Jewish baker, mipnei shehi sha'at adachak, because there's a pressing need there. The Rama adds, v'yesh omrim, and some say, dafilu b'mkom shepat Yisrael matzui, even in a place where there is Jewish bread, shari, it's permissible. Maran writes about pat shel baalei batim, en sham mi shemoreh ba lahakel, but bread baked residentially, there is no one who permits it. Sheikar hagezera mishum chatnut, because the main prohibition is, this is just copy and paste from the Rambam, because the prohibition is to marry them, and if you eat their bread, you'll come to eat in their homes. The Rama goes, what about a non-Jewish residential person who bakes bread in their home to sell commercially? Those are interesting details. So, right now, we're dealing with a situation that Maran quotes a halakha saying it's prohibited, but then he brings a minhag. There are those that are lenient about it. This usually would fall into the rules of, Maran says something bistam, and then he says yesh omrim. The yesh omrim is rejected for the stam. We would follow, there's a prohibition here. But being that Maran spends so much time here on all of these yesh mishomer, yesh omrim, yesh mishomer, I have to tell you that I can't go further without saying that the custom in all of the Jewish communities, with the exception of one, is that bread baked by non-Jews in a commercial setting is mutar. I have to jump to the end. I will show you some examples of that later. But there's no way to understand why Maran would write anything further if this was all prohibited. If it's all prohibited, then what does it matter? It's a bad minhag. Maran would even quote it. But this is something, clearly, like the Rambam, he understands, it's something that is not even, it's almost permitted. It's very, really not prohibited. It's almost, like Rambam says, karov l'heter. It's a very small issur. And because of that, this didn't spread across the whole Jewish community, and there's a reason to be lenient in this matter. If you look here, Pat Balabait, in the bottom of page 9, in source 2, in the bottom right column, Kadva Rambam u'Maran, the Rambam and Maran both write this, V'yesh gzerat chadnut, and there is a decree against coming to intermarriage. U'lefi de'ah zo shel Rambam, and according to this opinion of the Rambam, v'chen da'at Arif, and the Arif, v'Arashba, afilu en pat Yisrael metzuya, even if there is no Jewish bread available, asur pat balabait. According to the basic law, it doesn't make a difference if there's Jewish bread available, Jewish bread is not available. You're not allowed to buy bread baked by non-Jews. V'dat Rama, in the custom of the Rama, the opinion, l'hakel u'minhag Ashkenaz, kemo shekatav Maran b'sif chet. And the custom of Ashkenaz is exactly what Maran writes in the 8th section of these halachot. Yesh mi she'omer, there is one who says Maran. If you want to see this inside, you can see it here. On page 11, chet. Yesh mi she'omer, Divemakom she'en palter matzui klal, in a place where there is no Jewish baker at all, mutar. Even a non-Jewish baker. There is no commercial bakery. Mutar, it's permissible. Afilu shel baalei batim, even residential bread. Says the Rama, ve'en tzarich lehamtin al pat kasher. You don't have to wait for kasher bread. V'chen nohagin, and this is the Ashkenazi custom. So what is the Ashkenazi custom regarding bread? Is it in a place where there's no commercial bakery? You don't have to bake your own bread. You can even go buy residential bread from your next door neighbor. You can get bread from anybody. This entire gezerah disappears. Maran and the Rambam would not agree. In that situation, you can buy bread in a commercial setting, but not bread ever in a residential setting. Let's look at Halakha Gimel. Yesh mi shomer, there's one who says, She'im palter hizmin Yisrael, hari pito kepad malabayit. That if a baker invites you to come eat bread with him, then that bread is no longer commercial bread, rather it's residential bread. Halakha Daled. Makom she'en palter Yisrael matzui. In a place where there is no Jewish baker, ledat matirin lekach pat mepater goy, im higia sham pater Yisrael, hari pat pater goy asura ad shimkor pater Yisrael pito. If there is no Jewish baker in town, and you now go to the non-Jewish bakery to buy bread, and all of a sudden, a Jewish baker shows up, he has a cart in the middle of the street, in the farmer's market, he's selling his bread, you have to wait until the Jewish person finishes selling his bread, that bread that you bought in the non-Jewish bakery in the morning, the whole time the Jewish person is selling bread, that bread stops being kasher. And magically, once the Jewish person is done selling their bread, then this bread in front of you becomes kasher. Yesh omrim, there are some who say, Shimi sheyesh biyado pat, that someone who has bread in their hand, or sheyesh pater Yisrael, or there's a Jewish baker, v'yesh pater goy, or se pat yafeh mimeno, and the non-Jewish baker bakes nicer bread than the Jewish baker does. O mimin acher, or the non-Jewish baker bakes a type of bread that Jewish people don't make. Biyado shel pater Yisrael, meaning, let's imagine, two scenarios. The Jewish people sell terrible, stale bread, or they don't know how to bake bread well, and the non-Jewish baker, they're artisan bread makers, their bread is delicious. Or another scenario, the Jews bake nice bread, but they don't sell whole wheat bread. They only sell white flour. But this artisan baker, he sells whole wheat bread. In any of these scenarios, mutar liknot mipalter goy b'makom shenagu heter b'pat shel pater. You can buy this bread from the non-Jewish baker, either that it's better or it's a different variety, in any place where the custom is to permit commercial bread of non-Jews. Dekevan dedato nocha yoter b'pat pater, ze mipnei chashivuto be'enav harei ze kepat dechuka lo. Because you like that bread the non-Jew has so much better than the Jewish bread, it's now considered a shat atchak for you. It's considered a pressing situation for you. You don't want to eat this terrible Jewish baked bread that they sell in the Jewish grocery store. You only like that special artisan bread that the non-Jews sell. So for you, eating kasher bread from a kasher bakery is considered a situation of great suffering. And because of that, there is one who says that it is permissible for you to go to the non-Jewish bakery, assuming that the minhag where you live is that you can buy commercial non-Jewish bread. And again, this doesn't apply to the Rama, because the Rama says that it doesn't make a difference. In any case, if you look here in the source on page 3, in the Sikumim of Harav Peretz, Vedat Rama says, Yesh omrim she'afilu b'makom shepat Yisrael matzui shari. There are those who write that even if there is Jewish bread, you can always buy non-Jewish bread. That's what the Mordechai writes. The Bach writes, Sheken pashat minhag b'chol medinot elu. Hakavana b'chol Ashkenaz. The Shach. The Bach says the custom in all of the Ashkenazi countries is that Ashkenazi Jews buy bread from non-Jews every day, all the time, and that's the custom that is prevalent all over Ashkenaz. The Shach agrees, and that's the halakha that Ashkenazim always had. This whole turn back to Pat Yisrael is a reinvention of Ashkenazi practice, like many other things. Halakha Vav. B'makom shenagu heter b'pat shel pater. In any place where there is it has been permissible the custom is to eat bread of a commercial baker, afilu hu nilosh bebetzim, even if it's kneaded with eggs, or shebetzim tochim al panav, even if there are eggs that are smeared on top of it, mutar, it's permitted. So maybe you could be concerned of the blood spots, like we discussed in the first class. Maybe you're concerned with the fact that the eggs you're not allowed to eat eggs that are cooked by non-Jews. But here it's mixed into the bread. All of these situations would be permissible. Aval in penada is a food that is still eaten in the Sephardic community. Shafa goy, that a non-Jew made, asur lechol ma'pasha. You're not allowed to eat that bread. We're going to discuss all of this already next week it's not. It has to do with bishul and everything else that happens like that. The Rama writes, this is a fascinating Rama. Anytime someone tells you that following Shulchan Aruch is too lenient, just read to them the Rama. The Rama says, V'yesh oslim, there are some who are prohibit. They prohibit b'patsha betzim tochim al panav. They prohibit any bread that has eggs smeared on the top of it. Mishum shehen be'en, because you can see them. V'enam betelim legabei apat, and they're no longer nullified in the dough of the bread. V'yesh behem mishum b'shulei goyim, and they're prohibited because it's considered food that is cooked by a non-Jew. V'chen nohagim, and that is the Ashkenazi custom. V'oto nilosh shekorin kichlech. O minei mitika shekorin lekach. These are types of cookies and cakes. Hem bichlal pat. They are considered bread, meaning that they are permissible to eat. Uv'makom shenohagim heter b'pat shel goyim gam hem mutarim. And any place where non-Jewish bread is permitted, so too all the other baked goods are permitted as well. V'lo amrinan sheyesh behem mishum b'shlei goyim, and they don't fall into the category of food which we are not allowed to eat when made by goyim. V'yesh minei nilosh shekorin kichlech. There's another type of cookie called kichlech. She'ofin otam al-barzelim. They bake them on iron rods or grates. U'moshchin ha-barzel b'shat afiyah b'chelev or b'chazir. And they smear forbidden fats or pig fat on top of those iron bars. Be'otan yesh lizaher o leosran. You should be prohibitive. I mean, you shouldn't eat them. V'chen ha-minhag, and that is the minhag. Which tells you that according to the Rama, what is the law? The law is that fat smeared rod is fine. But the Ashkenazi custom is to refrain from eating them. Just keep that one in your back pocket anytime somebody tells you that the machines that you have all have pig fat all over them and everything else. The Rama already discussed it here. On the top of page 11. Pat balabait asura leolam. Residential bread is forbidden always. Afilu kin'a palter mimeno. Even if a baker buys these goods and sells them commercially, this happens very often. There's an Arab market that I go to, and there are sometimes that they sell, it's Ramadan month, whatever, all kinds of special foods they sell there, and sometimes I go there, and you have to ask. The manager already, he knows me. Unfortunately, that store closed, but the manager, he knew me, and I would ask, these things, did they bake them here, or did that old lady make them in her house and then bring them here? Because this is relevant to this halakha here. If the old lady baked them in her home, it's residential bread, even though they're selling it commercially. And even if you buy them and send them to another Jew, so it's not many times removed, it's still prohibited. And baked things of a commercial bakery, are always permitted. Even if a residential person buys, so let's say your next door neighbor buys bread from the bakery. So that bread is kasher, but now they bring it home, this bread still stays kasher. We don't concern ourselves with who's holding the bread now. Rather, the baked goods are always, their kashrut status is always determined based on who baked them, not on who's owning them right now. And therefore, commercial bread that ended up in residential hands, it is permissible for your next door neighbor to make you a sandwich with commercial bread. But it is forbidden for the store to make you a sandwich with residential bread that they purchased and sell for you over there. We already read halakha chet together. Hidlik hagoy atanu. If the non-Jew turns on the oven, ve'afa bo Yisrael, and the Jewish person bakes in it, or shehidlik Yisrael, or the Jewish person turns on the oven, ve'afa hagoy, or the non-Jew baked it, or shehidlik hagoy ve'afa hagoy, or both steps were done by a non-Jew, uva Yisrael v'nier ha'esh me'at, and a Jewish person came and he shook up the fire a little bit. Harei ze mutar, this is permitted. And even if he only threw a little stick into the oven, all of the bread in the oven is now permissible. The only reason we do these things is just to remember, it's a heker, that their bread is prohibited to us. Many, many major organizations, I will not mention names, they rely on this in extreme fashions. So what they do is, they have a kitchen somewhere in a different country, and they're baking bread. And what do? They turn on the oven via remote control. Wonders of technology. We're all sitting together all over the world, just like you can turn on your screen and it can see you, they can turn on the oven in another country. But there are some that are they take this to such an extreme, They don't even turn on the oven. The non-Jews turn on the oven. Rather, what do? They have a special light bulb they install in the oven. It's an oven-safe light bulb. And they turn on the light bulb, let's say from New York. They're just in New York, they press the button, boom, the light bulb turns on in China. What does the light bulb help? The light bulb adds even a minuscule amount of heat, just like throwing a wood pick into the oven. And because of that, they will now write on the label, this bread is Pat Yisrael. It always amazes me that somebody would eat that bread that is baked in another country by non-Jews with a Jewish person who turns on a light bulb, remote control, but they won't eat bread that is really, at the end of the day, mutar by the minhag, that was baked. Their bread is also baked by non-Jews. They just feel like it's not baked by non-Jews. Says Maran, the Rama writes, Vim nafach ba'esh have kechitui. Then what happens if you don't even stoke the coals? You just blow at them. You blow at the coals, and that is also permissible. The Pri Chadash agrees with that. I brought him on source on page 10 at the top left of the page. The Pri Chadash writes that the Chashulchan, Tzedek, Kavachayim, they all agree. So nobody disagrees here with the Rama. Then blowing on the coals would also be okay. Yud Aleph. I'm skipping Yud. Pan shel Yisrael, she'afa'a goy, belo chitui d'Yisrael u'velo kesam. Non-Jewish bread that was baked without any kind of stoking the coals, no throwing wood in there. Asur lezabune legoy. You're not allowed to sell it to a non-Jew. Dilma ate lezabune Yisrael, because maybe he'll end up selling this bread to a Jewish person. Vim pitet alechem l'shnayim mutar lezabune legoy. Okay. Let's go to the Pri Chadash. There's a Pri Chadash I quoted in source 4. Kata Pri Chadash Moshe Marikash. Hamoshlim, the government rulers. Shenotnim b'chol yom pat lemeshartim u'lorifim ha'Yisraelim. Every day they send bread to their employees, their doctors. They have Jewish doctors in the palace of the king. And they send bread from their kitchens. Everyone who works in the palace gets a loaf of bread today. Harei zeh kepan shel pater. That's considered commercial bread. V'lo chashiv shel bal habayit. And it's not considered bread that's residentially baked. V'yafeh katav, says the Pri Chadash, he wrote very well. Mishum demistama da'ateh didhu ka'avid u'ma li limkor o liten b'matana u'lachil lepoalim hakol dino kepalter. All of this is considered commercial bread, and therefore it would be permissible in such a situation. So a practical thought here would be you're working in a building and there's a cafeteria kitchen and they're baking bread over there, and for all the employees in the company, at the end of the day, that's also considered commercial bread. Halakha Yud Bet. Maran writes, Im afah hagoy hapat belo chitui Yisrael u'belo kesam. If the non-Jewish person bakes the bread and the Jew is not involved at all, afilu karmu pnei hapat batanu, and even if the bread gets crusty in the oven, mo'il chitui Yisrael kozman shapat tzarich latanu. If the Jew comes and stokes the coals, even the bread is already baked, meaning it's already done. You could take it out of the oven now. So long as the bread umashbiach bafiyato adain, so long as the bread still gets better while it's staying in the oven, it's okay if a Jew comes even in the last minute and stokes the coals, the bread is permissible. V'yesh mi shomer shafilu hotzi hapat. There is one who says that even if you take out the bread, yesh takana lachziro latanur el Yisrael. I mentioned this in my first class. That if you take the bread that you bought in the bakery, it was done completely by goyim. Jews were not involved at all. And you bring it home, and put it back in your oven. Im hu mashbiach, if the bread gets better when you put it back in the oven, that bread is now permissible. Let me give you an example that happens every day. You buy bread. The bread was baked by non-Jews. The oven was lit by non-Jews. Jews were not involved in the process at all. If you take that bread home, you slice it up, and you put it in your toaster, now that bread becomes Pat Yisrael again. Because you were involved in the baking process. Yesh mi shomer. Halakha Yud Gimel. This is one of my favorite halachot, guys. You have to read this halakha because you'll see why. Let's say there's a person like me who is not particular to buy Jewish bread. I buy also non-Jewish bread. And I am hosted at a person's house who does not eat bread baked by non-Jews. So I permit, my host prohibits. And on the table there are 2 loaves of bread. There's Jewish bread, and there's that artisan bread that's better than the Jewish bread that a non-Jew baked. So my host doesn't eat pachel goyim. I eat pachel goyim. On the table there are 2 loaves, and the non-Jewish bread is better than the Jewish bread. Yivtza bal habayit min hayafeh. The homeowner should say hamotzi on the nicer of the 2 breads, which is the non-Jewish bread. Umutar bechol ota seuda bepachel goyim. And he can eat non-Jewish bread for the whole entire meal. Meaning, not just for hamotzi, it's better to choose the nicer of the 2 breads. But for the rest of the meal, because I'm there, because the bread of the non-Jew is better, he's allowed to eat the non-Jewish bread for the entire meal. Can you imagine if that was kashrut policy everywhere? Let's look at this. It's not the first time Maran mentions this halakha. Look, I brought you in bold. Source number 5. It says Maran. Pat goyim nikiya. Nice, clean, non-Jewish bread. Ufat kibar shel Yisrael. And not so nice Jewish bread. Im enon nizhar mipat goyim. If you are not particular about eating Jewish bread, mevarech alei zanem shirtzeh. You can recite a blessing over either one that you want. Why should you not recite a blessing over the nicer bread? Meaning, why can you choose also the bad Jewish bread? Because each one of these has a pro and each one has a con. The Jewish bread is nicer because it was baked by Jews. Its con is that it's not such nice bread. The non-Jewish bread, its pro is that it's a nicer bread, but its con is that it's pachel goyim. You can choose at that point, says Maran, either one of the 2 breads because they are now equal in status. And if you're careful about eating non-Jewish bread, you should remove the non-Jewish bread from the table until after hamotzi. You know why? Because really, according to halakha, there might be a reason why you should eat, even though you don't. You should eat the non-Jewish bread. How does Maran treating this entire halakha? It's not really a halakha. Very similar to what the Rambam writes in Perush HaMishnayot. V'im bal habayit eno nizhar mipat goyim. And if the host is not careful with non-Jewish bread, ven dato lechol kol esdar akpat goyim ki nikiya, and he chooses the whole meal only to eat the nicer non-Jewish bread. Aval bnei beto achlu mipat sheno naki shel Yisrael, but the residents, the people in his house, ate from the Jewish bread. Ushte halechem monachim al shulchan. Both of the breads are on the table. Tzarich livtzo al pat nikiya shel goyim. Ho'il v'hu hamotzeah ven dato lechol al moto pat. Because you're the one doing hamotzi, even though your family prefers the Jewish bread that's not so nice, because you prefer the non-Jewish bread, you have to recite hamotzi on the non-Jewish bread. Vim bal habayit nizhar mipat goyim. And if the host is careful not to eat bread baked by non-Jews, v'Yisrael sheno nizhar bekach mesev imo al shulchan, and a Jewish person who's not careful is sitting on the table. This is Maran's scenario from above. Kevan de mitzvah mutelet al bal habayit. Because the mitzvah is on the homeowner, yivtza min hayafeh shel goyim, vekevan shutar livtzoah hutar lechol haseuda. He has to eat from the non-Jewish bread, even though he never would, because it's nicer. And once he said hamotzi, he's now allowed to eat it for the rest of the meal. Mishnah Berurah has a hard time with this. And he says, listen, only when there's a guest. But if there's no guest, this wouldn't be allowed. Haraperetz writes here that he disagrees with the Mishnah Berurah. It has nothing to do with the guest. Haraperetz in source 7 says, V'dat tumat hadeshen shebimenu noveh din zeh. The origin of this whole halakha comes from tumat hadeshen. Mashma afilu belo oreach. Over there, it's obvious that it's even without a guest. Hitiru pat goyim kshu naki v'yafeh mimenu munach lefanav mipnei chavivut haberachah. Because saying a beracha, nice food, is so important, it's permitted to eat the non-Jewish bread, even though you don't normally eat non-Jewish bread. But the Mishnah Berurah is saying it's better only to do with a guest. That's the halakha. From here you see again, says Haraperetz, that this gezerah against non-Jewish bread was not unanimously accepted by the Jewish community. And the main point is that it's really permissible, and that is the custom. That all of these chachamim said it that way. Then the Rambam limits this permission only to commercial bread and not to residential bread, which we agree with. Maran talks about in Yudalet, the yogurt of non-Jews that has bread crumbs in it. You don't have to worry about it. Let's look at halakha tedvav. Mi shenishar mipat goyim. Somebody who's careful, they don't eat bread baked by non-Jews. Mutar lechol beke'ara im mi sheno nishar mimeno. he's allowed to eat from the same bowl as somebody who is careful. Give you an example. Because in Western culture, we rarely eat like Jewish people. Let's say I invite my friend to my favorite hummus restaurant in Jerusalem. You know what I'm talking about? They bring you a bowl, fresh hummus. In the middle of the bowl is ground beef or shawarma or whatever you might have in there. And they hand you a stack of pitot, and you and your friend are eating from the same bowl. Why? Why? Because that's how we eat. If you do that today, of course, they will look at you funny. But that was, in the olden days, we would be sitting on the floor eating with our hands. Now we cut up the pitot maybe with a knife, and we are pretend to be a little more cultured. But this is the scenario Maran is talking about. Now, the bread that he's eating, I don't eat. Or the bread that I'm eating, he can't eat. We're allowed to eat from the same bowl. Then chosheshin lepad goyim shebo. This decree doesn't carry over to the crumbs of non-Pat Yisrael bread that is now floating in the hummus. It doesn't work that way. And therefore, Rama says that it's any type of mixture. We're not worried, therefore, about Pat Goyim. Rama says, Yesh omrim, there are those who say, that a person who's careful about this halakha, and he eats with friends that are not so careful about this, he's allowed to eat with them, even for the simple reason of not fighting with them. Don't fight with your friends. They're eating pachal goyim, you also eat pachal goyim. Says the Rama, don't now take this to other places. If your friends are all eating lobster legs together, you don't do it. That's not the way you do it. If your friends are having pork chops together, don't eat pork chops with them. But pachal goyim is the type of situation where they permitted him to eat in that place so that he would not fight with his friends. Tedzayin, yesh mi she'omer. This halakha is important. I get phone calls all the time. You have people that come to SeaWorld in San Diego, or they come to vacation in San Diego. So always, we walk around here, you're at SeaWorld. Have we ever passed? Take my kids. You see this guy, he comes there, long black coat, peot down to his chin, big beard, but he's wearing a baseball cap, so nobody will know that he's Jewish. He's a Jewish in disguise. Yeah? And there's certain understanding that when I'm traveling, halakha doesn't apply. And all of us have this problem. You go to a place, you go to a place for vacation, there's no tefillah, there's no Shabbat, why do you go there for vacation? You can go there why do you drag your family away from Beit HaKnesset for Shabbat? You go to places, a nice Beit HaKnesset, go. But there are people, halakha doesn't apply to them when they're traveling. Says Maran, Yesh mi shomer, there's one who says, Shanizhar mipad goyim, that is somebody who's careful not to eat non-Jewish bread. V'hu baderech, but now he's traveling. Im yesh pat shel Yisrael adalet minin yamtin, that he should wait, if there's Jewish bread that's coming up, it'll be there within a certain amount of time. He should wait until he gets to the place where there is Jewish bread. The Rama says, I've already told you above that the custom is to be lenient and that we don't wait for Jewish bread, we just eat bread right away. So now, I finished with you all of the halachot in Shulchan Aruch, and I'm going to deal with minhagim right now. But I want to summarize what I've told you. Both the Rambam and Maran share with us there is a rabbinic law that prohibits eating bread from non-Jews, whether that's commercial bread or residential bread. But we see from the fact that there is a minhag in so many places to eat bread, commercial bread from non-Jews. I'm ignoring Ashkenazi custom right now. To eat commercial bread from non-Jews, that itself already shows us, like the Ran said, like the Ramban said, it already has shown us that this decree clearly didn't spread everywhere. And because it was not unanimously accepted, there are very many situations in which eating bread from non-Jews is completely okay, so long as that is the minhag of the place where you are in. And Rambam brought a little bit of that, and Maran embellished on that very much. And then we have the standard of the Ashkenazim, which is not only are they permissive when it comes to commercial bread, but they are permissive even when it comes to residential bread in many, many places. And that is based seemingly on the Mordechai and the Tosafot, who view that there's no difference between commercial bread and residential bread. Now the question we have to ask ourselves, so what is the minhag? We know what Shulchan Aruch says, we know what the Rambam says, but so much of this is dependent, are we following the strict letter of the law, or is there a minhag? And this is not just a minhag. So God forbid you shouldn't understand from me that minhag overrides halakha. You know very much how I feel about that. Halakha is halakha. Here you're talking about the codifiers of halakha telling you that this halakha does not apply in a place where there is a minhag that permits it. Because this decree of our rabbis clearly didn't spread in the Jewish community. Now, whether that was intentional or not, that was the conversation of the Gemara. But intentional or unintentional, that's what the Ramban says. We're not clear if a bedin permitted it or if people just rose up and did it anyways because they couldn't keep this. Regardless, we are today in a place where there is a minhag not to eat or yes to eat, and we have to discuss, so what is the minhag where we are? On page 13. Hara Peretz writes about the Knesset HaGedolah. Katav, he writes, Ve'ir Konstantina, in the city of Constantine. Uvechen b'chol mekomot elu, in all of these countries. When he says all of these countries, which region of the world is he referring to?
North Africa, the Sephardi kind of world around North Africa.
Where's Constantine?
Presumably in Turkey.
Right.
Algeria, no? Turkey.
Well, Yosef, you're shaking your head. Tell me what you're thinking.
I think it's Algeria, is it not?
I'm pretty sure that it's in Turkey. But if I'm wrong, it's for sure in Turkey, yes?
Constantinople's in Turkey. That's Istanbul. Constantine's North Africa.
What is known to me when Knesset HaGedolah says Constantina, he's referring to Turkey. If I'm wrong, someone should correct me. So all of this region, the whole, we could call it the Balkan region, the Ottoman Empire, wherever area we're referring to, all of these places of Sephardim, makom shnagu heter b'pat pater goyim hem. They're all places where they permitted non-Jewish bread. We're not so clear why they're permissive in this matter. Knesset HaGedolah has a problem. So I don't understand. In our places, we have Jewish bakers that make even nicer bread than the non-Jews. V'shamati memori harav, and I heard from my rabbi, hatam neheter zeh, the reason for this permissive attitude, שלא אמרו שבמקום שיש פטר ישראל מצוי, אין ניקח מפטר גוי, אלא כשפת ישראל מספיק לכל הדרים באותו העיר. אבל כשלא מספיק, הבלה כפת דחוקה לא מותר. In a place where there's a Jewish baker, and therefore you can't buy from a non-Jewish baker, that only applies if the Jewish baker has enough bread to cover all the Jews in the city. But being that the Jewish baker can't keep up with the demand of the Jewish community, then the Jewish people are allowed, therefore, to go buy bread from non-Jewish bakers. And that seems to be the rationale why in this region of the world, the Jewish people bought non-Jewish commercial bread. V'chen katav zivchei tzedek. Who wrote zivchei tzedek? Rabbi Abdullah Somech. I'm very lucky that his great-great-grandson is in my kehillah. Katav b'zivchei tzedek, he writes, Sheken nahagu b'Baghdad. The custom is in Baghdad. Shekonim mipalter goy, that they buy from a non-Jewish baker. Afilu b'mkom sheyesh palter Yisrael, even in a place where there is a Jewish baker. V'gam hu yoter yafeh mishel palter goy, even when the Jewish bread is nicer than the non-Jewish bread. Shim hayu konim akol mipalter Yisrael, because if the Jews would all buy from the Jewish baker, the bread would become very expensive. And therefore, for any reason, we always buy bread from non-Jewish bakers, even when their bread is less nice than the Jewish bread, and that's the custom in Baghdad. So I'll tell you that it's like in the old city of Yerushalayim. There are these beautiful bakeries, make rugalach and chalot. And then right next door, there's an Arab bakery. All he knows how to make is pitot. He has no ability to make any other baked product aside from pitot. I would buy pitot there all the time. His bread is 5 shekels for a pita. Another guy sells 15 shekels for a pita. And at the end of the day, I'm a student who's it's a sha'at atchak for me. But yeah, we would buy bread from that baker next door. Now, if you wanted to be machamir, we could blow on his fire, and then everything would be good for us. But so we already have in the region of Turkey, we have in Baghdad, the custom is to be permissive. Let's see what happens when the Ben Ish Chai, who is a Kabbalist by nature, deals with this minhag. The Ben Ish Chai writes in Parashat Chukat of the second year of the Ben Ish Chai, V'yesh mekilin liknot min palter goy. There are those who are lenient to buy from a non-Jewish commercial baker. Afilu shesh palter Yisrael matzui, even when there is a Jewish baker. V'chen nohagim po birenu Baghdad, and that is the custom here in Baghdad. Liknot min palter goy, afal pi shematzui palter Yisrael. So he's confirming that which Rabbi Abdullah Somech wrote, that the custom in Baghdad is to eat the bread from the goyim. V'Rabbeinu Arizal, and our Rabbi the Arizal, Machmir, he's stringent. Afilu b'safekim pater Yisrael pater goy. Even if you're not sure whether the bread is Jewish bread or non-Jewish bread, the Arizal wouldn't eat it. I told you at the beginning of the shiur that the custom in all of the countries was to eat commercial bread from non-Jews. and there was only one community that did not eat non-Jewish bread. Which community have I identified? The Mekubalim. The Mekubalim who followed the Arizal, they were careful not to eat non-Jewish. When I remember asking how parents many years ago, he told us when you become a Mekubal, you can stop eating non-Jewish bread. Until then, all the minhag in all of the places was to eat non-Jewish bread. In Ashkenaz for sure, but in Sephardic countries also. Who recorded that? Mekubalim, Rabbi Abdullah Somech and the Ben Ish Chai. The Chida. Also, the Chida writes also that in Constantina, the non-Jewish bread is consumed, and he quotes again the Knesset Gedulah. Rabbi Yosef Masas.
Rabbi Yoni, I think Rabbi Yosef is correct. Constantine was the emperor who both established Constantinople, which is Istanbul, but Constantine is actually a region which would modern day be Algeria. Though it could be in this context, it's being used to refer to Turkey.
Where did Knesset Gedulah live? Can you look that up for me?
Yes.
Thank you.
Knesset Gedulah?
Yeah.
It was
Where?
Ishmael. Yeah?
That's what I think also.
Turkey.
I thought he was a Turkish Chacham.
He was
No, that I'm not doubting, but Constantine in modern Hebrew, in the modern world, is referring to areas in Algeria.
Okay, so then all of you, Elu velu divrei Elohim chaim, all of you are right, but Rabbi Knesset Gedulah, he lives in Turkey, and that's likely what he's referring to. Rabbi Yosef Masas, they've redone the Teshuvot of Rabbi Yosef Masas. You should know for years, I couldn't get my hands on the writings of Rabbi Yosef Masas. Some of them scattered here, scattered there, all kinds of different places. And the one set that I was missing for years, there were two books that I was missing. One was a book on Gitin from Rabbi Yosef Masas. Baruch Hashem, in the UK, you have a Dayan. I don't mention him, I don't know who he is, I don't know him, but he published a 4-volume series on the laws of Gitin, and the last volume has a republished edition of the Halachot of Rabbi Yosef Masas. And then I was once in Muncie, New York. My wife was finishing her master's degree, and she was staying in Muncie, and I would come visit her from San Diego. It's a 5.5-hour flight. I said, she's like, where do you want to go? You want to eat? I said, I want to see a bookstore. Jewish communities, I have food at home. I want to see a bookstore. I don't have a bookstore in San Diego. So she took me to a Jewish bookstore over there. And I came into the bookstore. And I asked them, is there a Sephardic section here? Somewhere I could find books that are not, Rabbi so-and-so on the weekly Parsha. And they said, we don't really have Sephardic books here. And like the way he said it was with such zilzul, like we don't even bother to carry your books. That was the way he said it. I said, okay, you must have something Sephardic. He's like, yeah, we have a few Ben Ish Chais and Rav Avadias in the back. So I'll go head that direction and I'll see what he has. The truth is, he had nothing. Not much. Really a Ben Ish Chai, that's what he had. And so I looked in the rest of the store to see, I don't read much of the other books that he has there. And at a certain point I said, I can't believe that a bookstore this large wouldn't have even one other Sephardic book. And I was like upset at myself. Why did I come here? I wasted my time. I was holding my son Elchanan. At the time he was a baby. He wasn't walking yet. And I held in my hands and he dropped his bottle on the floor. And I'm like, oh man, the bottle fell and then make a mess. I got down on the floor to get the bottle, like Min Shemayat. It's like one of those Hasidic stories. I see there on the bottom shelf, covered in dust, 3 volumes of letters of Rabbi Yosef Masas. These books have been out of print since the 80s. And you can't find them anywhere. You have money, you can't find them. They don't sell them. Until today, you can't find a set of those books. New, for sure not used. If somebody will sell them to you, it's only because they died and their kids don't know what to do with the books. So I went to the store and I picked this book up. I ran to him. I said, hey, you have Sephardi books. How much do you want for these books? He says, you know how long those books have been sitting there? We put them on the bottom because nobody even wants them. Give me $60 and you can go. I gave him $60. I made a shechianu outside of the store. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, thank you for letting me find these books. Ever since then, the halachic letters, not the rest of the letters, but the halachic letters of Rabbi Yosef Masas have been reprinted in 4 volumes by his grandson in Israel, and you can actually purchase these fairly inexpensive. So they cost, a set is maybe $100 for all 4 volumes of this book, and it's worth getting your hands on these books. They did a nice job with the print and the vowels and the footnotes and everything else. In there, Rabbi Yosef Masas, and that's why I give you 2 sources. So in number 3, it says either if you look in the original edition or in the newer edition. Sha'al Kevado, you have asked me, Binyan Pach Nochim, regarding non-Jewish bread. Can I eat the bread of a baker? Says Rabbi Yosef Masas, this is what Shulchan Aruch says, Upo b'chol arei Algerin. And then here in all the cities of Algeria, that's where he was, even though he was Moroccan, he was a rabbi in Algeria. No matter what the situation is, they permit it. And he brings for the name of a Chacham there, Shechen Pashat HaMinhag, Lakel Mizman Kadmon. This is a very early minhag of Sephardim. It's not something that just happened in these cities due to lack of Torah observance. V'chen shamati mikam Ashkenazim Charadim. And I heard this also from very devout Ashkenazi travelers, Ovrei Orach, who traveled through here. Shebechol arei Ashkenaz. Then in all of the cities of Ashkenaz, Haminhag pashut akel b'pat pater. They all buy non-Jewish commercial bread. Yeh kemo sheyeh, no matter what the situation is. Uv'chen hamekil lo hifsid. And whoever wants to be lenient about this has lost nothing in halacha. And there's a lot to say about this. But I'm very afraid of what will happen to me if I speak about this. Because people are not able to agree with each other on these matters. V'shalom, and goodbye. Now, I have more to say about how permitted this is, but I'm afraid to put it down on paper. If you know anything about Rabbi Yosef Masas, he was afraid of very few things, but clearly this issue was such a hot topic that he didn't want to stick his nose inside of it. I know what time it is. If you could just give me 5 more minutes, I will finish with you this last source that I want to pull up for you. And that is from the Kav HaChaim. Rabbi Yaakov Chaim Sofer, he wrote a commentary in the Shulchan Aruch, Kav HaChaim. It's very prevalent in the Sephardic community. It's almost like a Mishnah Berurah, if you can imagine, on the Shulchan Aruch, the first section and a little bit of Yoredah. He writes here, he quotes all of these things that we know, that in Baghdad and so on and so forth, and in Constantine, that all of these places were permissive regarding bread baked by non-Jews. And then he writes at the bottom of page 13, Lamed Aleph, Umihu, nonetheless, Hagam shekena minhag liknot mipater goy. Even though this is the custom, yesh anshe maaseh she'enam ochlim mipater goy klal v'ikal. There are anshe maaseh, like God-fearing individuals, that they don't eat bread from non-Jews at all. ואנחנו אפילו מפטר ישראל אין אוכלים, יען שרוב הפטרים הם עמי הארצות. It says Kav HaChaim that I don't even eat bread from, or he's quoting maybe from Zivchet Tzedek, we don't even eat bread from Jewish bakers. Why? Because they're ignoramuses. They are not careful to strain the worms out of the water that they use. We don't even, Zivchet Tzedek says, we don't even eat, though the minhag is to eat from the non-Jewish bakeries, we don't even eat, nothing to do with Kabbalah, everything to do with the fact that there are worms in the water that they use when they bake bread in Jewish bakeries. And therefore, this maybe is the first time we're seeing a push for kashrut agencies. There should be a group of people that are in charge of straining the water, or supervising the bakers, to make sure that the chalot or pitot or lafot that you buy don't have wiggly worms in the water when you bake your bread. Now, you might say, okay, so that's where it comes from. We're strict because we follow this and we don't eat bread baked by non-Jews. So let me show you what else Rabbi Yaakov Chaim Sofer says. He says here in source 5, צריך אדם לשמור מאוד שלא לאכול לחם מפטר קוטי, אפילו קנוי מפטר ישראל, ואפילו בספק, ואפילו אם קונים מפטר ישראל, צריך לחקור אם עשו מישראל. He quotes the Arizal. The Arizal says that you can't eat non-Jewish bread. והיינו מידת חסידות. But again, this is חסידות, it's Kabbalah. דאנשי מעשה אינם אוכלים מפטר גוי כלל ועיקר, because in general, the Kabbalists don't eat non-Jewish baked bread. But that's not where it ends. If you look in source 6, פת גויים. Here in Jerusalem, there are worms in the well water. And many people, presumably they came from Baghdad, where they buy commercial bread. And now they're in Jerusalem, they buy non-Jewish commercial bread. And they're mistaken. And they need all of our bread with warm water, without filtering it. Because the Arabs, they don't care about the worms in the water. They eat them, but we can't eat them. And then he says, V'zot acheret. More than that, now, there are new flowers that are infested with worms, big worms, small worms. Then the non-Jews, they don't care about the worms in the water, they don't care about the worms in the flour, and the bread that you buy, even though it may be kasher because of pashel goyim, it's not kasher because of the worms. And therefore, because of that, in any city which has a problem of worms, you cannot buy commercial bread. Okay, that sounds reasonable. Now listen to the last section of the Kav HaChaim.
Recording stopped.
The Kav HaChaim writes, I don't know if the recording intentionally stopped. The Kaf HaChaim says, Gam bezeh to'im. Also about this, they're incorrect. B'ma sheshotin hakafeh shel goyim. That they drink coffee from non-Jews. Shosim ma'amayim haniskarim, because they make them from water that has worms. וגם בזה טועים במים שבכלים שמניחים הגויים בבית אחד לשתות מהם, עוברים ושבים. And even these little stations the non-Jews have put up that have water for everybody to drink, travelers can come and drink water. It's forbidden to drink non-Jewish water. Why? Because they have worms. הכלל העולה, the rule from everything, כל דבר שמניחים בו מים אסור לקח מן הגויים, במקום ההוא שיש תולעים במים צריך אדם להשליח ויתן דתו על זה. Now we stay away from anything that has non-Jewish water in it, because the non-Jews are not careful about the worms in the water. Somebody once told Haraperetz that he doesn't eat non-Jewish bread because they don't know how to sift the flour properly to get the worms out of the flour. And then Haraperetz told him that your zilzul, your denigration of all of our forefathers who ate bread from non-Jews is so much worse of a prohibition than eating any kind of worm inside of a bread. The fact that you think that you're so religious today that you're not going to eat bread that all of our forefathers, all of us, unless your grandfather floated on a magic carpet and was a Kabbalist, all of our grandparents were eating bread that were baked by non-Jews. Not by throwing a twig in the oven, and not by turning on the oven, and not by anything. They ate bread baked by non-Jews, and therefore, Klal Yisrael, the custom of the whole Jewish people, has always been, regardless of history revisionists, has always been that non-Jewish bread baked in a commercial setting is mutar, it is permissible. And that Jewish bread, non-Jewish bread, that is baked in a residential setting, with the exception of the Ramah and Tosafot, that bread we refrain from entirely. And that being the case, you may now understand why Maran in the laws of Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, which I didn't bring here, he says that those who are not careful of eating Jewish bread the whole year, some have a custom during the 10 days of Teshuvah to return to the original law of the Talmud and not eat bread baked by non-Jews. But aside from that, and aside from those 10 days, non-Jewish baked goods, assuming that all the ingredients are kasher, the pots, pans, utensils, and ovens are kasherim, and assuming that all of the flour is yashan, which we'll talk about at a different moment in time, then all of the bread and baked products of goyim will be permitted. And the Kadosh Baruch Hu should help us, that no mistakes should come from the study of this halakha, that only we should know that you can that you can go and you can eat, and that was the minhag of all of Klal Yisrael, and it is not a contradiction to halakha. And I hope that I've presented this matter clear enough to you that you shouldn't have any questions. But if you do, I will stay here for as long as you need to answer all of them. Please.